We began our discussion this morning, and I touched on the idea that antebellum Alabama was certainly a cosmopolitan society. And we have seen that as we talk about the Border Brothers, their master being of German descent. Then you found the African influence coming into the state with slavery during the antebellum period. And if we dig deeper, we see that certainly society is very integrated in the sense of you will find freedmen interacting with slaves, slaves interacting with freedmen, freedmen interacting with the white master. And you find some people holding on to frontier traditions and others moving on in the truest sense of being a person from a cosmopolitan society. I have loved studying the social interaction of the people of antebellum Alabama. And most of my research centered on the life of citizens from the Black Belt, and specifically of William Rufus King. And I would say about 20 years ago, I was visiting one evening as a house guest of Mr. and Mrs. Caldwell Delaney in Mobile. I was researching William Rufus King at the time, and Mr. Delaney leaned back in his chair and he said, "I want you to promise me something. I have devoted much of my life to King's counterpart, his female counterpart from antebellum society, Octavia Walton Levert. There's more to be done, and I hope you will do some of that." And I promised Mr. Delaney that I would give Madame Levert some attention, and I hopefully have given her the kind of attention that he would want in talking about her with this program today. If I can have the lights, please. Since the very beginning of time, men and women have stood on shore watching horizons, longing for destinations far beyond their comprehension. The feeling of reaching for the unknown has defined human nature. We have longed to discover, explore new environments, and answer questions embraced by antiquity. We have aspired to influence minds, to warm hearts, and to provide a greater understanding at home, abroad, and far beyond. Mid-19th century Americans followed the footprints of 18th century grandparents. They questioned both logic and reason, but they also embraced nature, looking for illumination in arts and design. They studied the civilizations of ancient Greece and Rome and adopted sources of creativity and symbols of national identity. 19th century America reached out to frontiers in the West and languished in the great lessons of the past. The challenges of home and the fascination of the world abroad melded the mind and soul of Alabamians and all Americans. The minds of men, women, and children, rural and urban, flourished in spite of hardship and circumstance. They learned, traveled, and they collected. In the 1850s, one of these shared her travel experiences with America and helped preserve a symbol of beauty and her national heritage. Octavia Celestia Valentine Walton was born in 1810 at Bellevue, her maternal grandmother's plantation home near Augusta, Georgia. There, amid aristocratic surroundings, she learned family history and began a path to becoming one of the South's premier belles and a grande dame of antebellum culture. Most of her first 10 years was spent studying life at home and abroad. Her grandmother taught Octavia and her younger brother history instead of fairy tales. Mrs. George Walton made her lessons so interesting that she planted seeds for her granddaughter's lifelong love of country and her firm conviction for America's greatness. Octavia was adored by her parents. Her father, George Walton Jr., seen here in a portrait by John Wesley Jarvis, was the son of a Revolutionary hero and the signer of a Declaration of Independence. The younger Walton, a graduate of Princeton, was a lawyer, a politician, and a public service. Octavia's mother, Sally Minge Walker, portrayed by the Kentucky artist William Edward West, was the daughter of another prominent Georgia couple. A refined and educated woman, Sally tutored Octavia at home, emphasizing the arts and her daughter's special aptitude for languages, including French, Spanish, and Italian. Mrs. Walton saw Octavia as a future queen of American society and stressed social graces and the ardent love of country. In 1822, George Walton moved his family from Augusta to Pensacola, where he became Secretary of the new Territory of Florida. In time, Walton succeeded Andrew Jackson as governor and, according to tradition, asked his cultured daughter to suggest a name for the new capital city. As the story goes, Octavia befriended Neamathla, a Seminole chieftain, whose endearing influence persuaded her to suggest the name Tallahassee, a Muskogee word meaning beautiful land. Over the next 10 years, Octavia matured in depth and intellect. In 1825, when General Lafayette toured the United States as an official guest, he invited Dorothy Walton, the signer's widow, to meet with him in Mobile. Unable to make the trip from Georgia, he sent Octavia, age 14, from Tallahassee. The elderly Mrs. Walton held in her possession mementos of her husband's career, including his miniature by Charles Willson Peale. Knowing that Octavia could address the general in French, she asked her granddaughter to show him the tiny image and relate her heartfelt regards. This event left a lasting impression. In later years, Octavia recorded memories of the meeting, underscoring Lafayette's encouragement for her brilliant future. By the end of the decade, Octavia's social skills flourished. In 1829 and 1830, she and her mother traveled the United States, visiting important cities of the day. In Washington, they toured the Capitol, where they encountered leading executive and legislative officials. In a letter dated April 4th, 1830, Octavia captured the scene. Today, as we walked on the green near the Capitol, we were suddenly approached by President Jackson. A war-worn hero, he seems pensive and sad, determined yet distant. Erect and lean, he makes a somber image with his tall white hat, decked with the wide band of mourning. Many people say that he wears his wife's memory as a national symbol. While Octavia observed Jackson, other dignitaries showered her with awe and admiration. Visiting the halls of Congress, she listened to orations by eminent senators, Webster, Calhoun, and Clay. In time, Henry Clay would become one of her closest friends. Although much of Clay's correspondence with Octavia has been destroyed, surviving letters attest to his admiration for the young woman he eventually dubbed his most prized friend. Octavia loved Washington, and Washington loved her. She made her debut in the city, and it was there that she sat for her beguiling portrait by Thomas Sully. In the Capitol, she also developed a valued cultural connection with Edgar Allan Poe, who provided her with introductions to the writers Washington Irving and Henry Wadsworth Longfellow. The life of Octavia Walton bloomed just as Lafayette predicted. In 1836, she married Henry Strachey Levert of Mobile, a young doctor whose practice, reputation, and fortune helped to make her the queen of Mobile society. Octavia was honored by her marriage. She took pride in her husband's French heritage and his strong family relationship with Count Rochambeau, another French nobleman who influenced the American War for Independence. She spelled Levert with a capital V, and she adopted for herself a self-appointed French title of Madame. The Leverts made a dashing pair, and their home on Government Street, seen on the left and again on the street corner in the right image, became the center of intellectual expression. Mobile prospered in the 1840s, and so did the reputation of Madame Levert. Following the French tradition, she established a salon, receiving guests on Mondays, beginning in the morning and continuing until evening. Notables including P.G.T. Beauregard, Millard Fillmore, James Buchanan gathered with artists like Edward Troy and actors including the Booth brothers and Joe Jefferson to discuss history, art, politics, and philosophy. Madame Levert was the center of attention. Her knowledge, intellectual conversation, charm, and social awareness captivated attention. The rich and famous adored her, and people of wit and learning swarmed to her residence. As one newspaper declared, the moon shone across Mobile's bay and beamed like a beacon from the Leverts' Government Street home. A portrait by C.R. Parker, painted in Mobile in 1844, illustrates the recollection of one admirer. I remember Madame Levert's appearance on that occasion. To see her was bewildering, and all her color was in harmony. She moved like a bird on the wing. I can see her now as she swayed and glided, holding her golden gown as she floated. Her charming grace glisten in my memory. For Octavia, Henry Clay's friendship was forever true. Marriage and motherhood failed to diminish her charm, and Clay remained a frequent guest in the Levert home. In 1846, Dr. Levert wrote the Kentucky senator that he and Octavia hoped to have their fifth child, and it would be a boy to be named Henry. Of course, Clay knew that Henry was also Dr. Levert's name, yet Clay replied, I have thought of presenting a memento to Henrietta, my little namesake, so it occurred to me that a silver cup would be useful to her as a present. Will you do me the honor of accepting it for her? Madame Levert was the pride of antebellum Mobile, and by far the city's most celebrated citizen. In winter, she resided at home or in New Orleans, where she held salons in the St. Charles Hotel. During hot summer months, she visited resorts at Saratoga and Newport, bridging a social divide between the Old North and the Old South. Composers dedicated works in her honor, and people from all walks of life paid homage to her matchless persona. Regardless of social triumph, Octavia's life was shattered with dark times. In 1849, Robert Walton, her only sibling, died at age 37. Before her brother's tombstone could be erected, her two young daughters, Sally and Claudia, succumbed to a similar fever. Grieving three losses, Octavia lamented, "Death lies on them like an untimely frost, for they were the loveliest flowers of the field." To overcome multiple grief, Dr. Levert encouraged his wife's mourning and encouraged her to consider a lifelong desired trip to Europe. As months passed, Octavia's sorrow faded, and she finalized travel plans to include her father and her daughter Octavia, affectionately known as Diddy. On June 11, 1853, they sailed from New York to Liverpool aboard the steamship Atlantic. Octavia Walton Levert was about to fulfill her lifelong dream of a European tour. Prepared with letters of introduction, the party arrived in bustling London. Invitations were numerous and the city proved joyful. Madame wrote that she was entranced by the parks in Westminster Abbey. And I quote, "The Abbey flooded me with emotions that no words or any language can describe." She would also write, "As an avid reader of poetry and somewhat of a poet myself, I connected with Poets' Corner, where all my dearest and oldest friends lay buried." Filled with curiosity, Octavia visited every place of interest: the Tower of London, the National Gallery, and the British Museum. She described the museum as glorious, immense, and filled with antiquities from throughout the world. She would write, "The Elgin marbles are wonderful, not only in their preservation but in their beauty. From the Portland vase to the handwriting of Shakespeare, I am brushed by the hands of history." In another journal entry, she mused, "Grandfather Walton's blood runs deep in my veins. Today I visited the House of Peers and the House of Commons. I heard the eminent Disraeli. His style of debate is more conversational than oratorical. Disraeli's affluence of thought characterizes strength and good breeding. But alas, he lacks the godlike eloquence of Henry Clay." In letters to her mother, Octavia related details of her travels. A perfect example of her photographic memory is the account of her presentation at Buckingham Palace. "Dazzling was the scene on the grand stair, resplendent as the day with flashing diamonds and sparkling gems. There were more than 2,000 guests, every lady in a magnificent gown, and every gentleman in court dress or uniform. Queen Victoria was more handsome than painters represent her. Her dress of white lace embroidered with straw and green silk, her hair parted on the forehead and bound with an elaborate headpiece centered with a diamond. She wore diamond earrings, and around her bodice was a ribbon, the Order of the Garter, clasped with radiant gems. Of course, I was honored and delighted when the Lord Chamberlain presented me to Her Majesty. The occasion was an enchanting incident, and my heart bounded with emotion as I gazed upon the lovely Victoria." A final highlight of England was Madame's visit to St. Paul's Cathedral. In a sensitive note, she penned, "We visited this morning the Cathedral of St. Paul. It is closely surrounded by houses and lost when one approaches. An excellent view is obtained from the Thames. In truth, from all points, this magnificent dome rises above all other objects like a giant sentinel watching over the city. Standing beneath the great dome, the effect of light is admirable. It truly seems as though heaven is roofed over the cathedral. The dome is the finest in the world, save that of St. Peter's, which I pray I will someday see." Throughout her travels, Octavia opened the lid of her lap desk to record experiences and to write to her anxious mother in Mobile. Descriptive letters recall an emotional journey and reveal day-to-day experiences among the sights and sounds of 19th century Europe. Today, as we read Octavia's writings, we can identify with her observations and her strong Anglo-Franco existence. Reading her descriptions of France, we can fully appreciate her abiding interest in Napoleon and his lasting place in history. On July 22nd, 1853, she communicated, "Today, I wandered among the trees of the Champs-Élysées and gradually ascended 1 mile to the Arc de Triomphe. This is indeed one of the grandest monuments of Paris. It is worthy of Napoleon, who laid the foundation, though it was completed by Louis Philippe. It is a single arch, 96 feet in height, while the entire structure rises 162 feet. The pediment, the frieze, and the panels are covered by immense figures representing great events in the history of France. There is one of war, calling the people to battle, another of victory, crowning Napoleon, another of fame, sounding forth his warlike deeds to all nations. Within the arch are recorded all of his victories and the names of his generals. We ascended 280 steps to the summit of the arch, and there was Paris, grandly magnificent, spread out like a chessboard with all of its columns of triumph." With this admiration for the emperor, it comes as no surprise that Octavia wanted to visit Notre Dame and see the spot where Napoleon and Josephine were crowned in 1804 and where Pope Pius VII had been brought against his will for the coronation. For Octavia, the walls of Notre Dame and the Louvre resounded the Napoleonic songs of greatness. Octavia wrote, "Even Charlemagne went to Rome to receive the crown, but for Napoleon, whose will was resistless, His Holiness had to come to Paris." The Levert party also planned to visit the Belgian battlefield of Waterloo. In early morning light, they took a stagecoach along a highway cut by Napoleon's engineers. Reaching the battlefield, Octavia hired 2 guides, one English and one French, as each challenged the other to give the true story of the battle. Madame Levert described the scene. "The earthly plain is very level and covered with rich, waving fields of grain. The growth of wheat, the French guide told me, was particularly luxuriant where the bodies of the emperor's soldiers' bodies fell." Octavia noted that after walking for several miles over the field, she viewed the monument standing against the streaked azure sky. "It was here that I realized Napoleon's defeat. I felt his presence as a balmy wind blew against my cheek." Octavia found no place too distant or remote. Today, one wonders how many hundreds of miles she walked and how she did it wearing expensive and uncomfortable shoes of the 1850s. Leading her tireless troop, she traveled Geneva, Como, Milan, Verona, and finally Venice, the place both she and her father wished to see. They visited many of the places they had heard about, but it was the Cathedral of St. Mark that left them the most enchanted. Octavia described the majestic edifice. Great domes and minarets adorn the summit like those of a Turkish mosque. Just above the central doorway are the world-renowned bronze horses about whose origin such mystery hangs. They have been travelers in their day. A history tells us they were brought from Alexandria to Rome, from Rome to Constantinople, thence to Venice, and from Venice to Paris, and with the downfall of Napoleon, returned to their ancient position. On the last night in Venice, Octavia devoted the entire evening to a moonlight voyage around the city. She described the setting. "We directed the cabin of the gondola to be removed that our eyes might gaze for the last time upon the exquisite view. To no other city in the world can Venice be compared. It alone is peerless in its beauty. It is the ocean queen. Reclining upon the luxurious cushions of our gondola, I read aloud to my father in ditty and felt the calm of Byron's portrait. There in the darkness, with the illumination from above, we lingered, capturing forever an evening in Venice. When Madam, Colonel Walton, and Diddy returned to Mobile, they found that they had escaped the most severe epidemic of yellow fever the city had ever experienced. In 1853, there were 22,000 people living in Alabama's port city. Yet 3 weeks after the epidemic, the population was reduced between 10 and 12,000. In time, some of those who fled returned and life resumed. Madame Levert reopened her elegant parlors for Monday night salons, entertaining guests with stories of European celebrities. Dr. Levert listened to tales of his wife's conquest and longed to visit there. In record time, Madame Levert made plans for a second voyage that would include her husband and Diddy. In January 1855, the family traveled to New Orleans, where they caught the steamer Black Warrior, bound for Havana, Cuba. Octavia described the beauty and climate of Cuba as tantalizing. Friends secured invitations for the Leverts to interesting events and social affairs. Madame was extravagant in her praise of the opera and the Tasson Theater, declaring that with the exception of La Scala in Milan, she had never seen a theater so splendid. Following the opera one night, the Leverts went to Domenica's, Havana's most famous restaurant. Dr. Levert would show his nationality by asking for a mint julep, whereupon a mixture of mint, rum, and sugared lime water was served. Inquiring as to the drink, the kindly doctor was informed that he held not a julep, but a mojito. The Leverts were also told that all who visited Cuba should see the Plaza de Toros along the Gulf shore. The amphitheater, like those of ancient times, was open and arranged with boxes like an opera house. Octavia estimated that it accommodated a crowd of 10,000. She vividly portrays a bugler signaling the pikemen and their matadors holding their red cloaks in their hands. Madame Levert penned, "At last the frenzied bull appeared, and the crowd shouted, 'Brave bull, noble bull.' Finally, one loud moan was heard above the bravos and shrieks of the people. Madame lamented, 'In all of this great assemblage, can there ever be anything more cruel?'" Lingering 2 weeks in the radiant Cuban city, they crossed the Atlantic, heading for Spain. Traveling through Spain, France, and Italy, they reached Rome in time for Holy Week. Octavia's writings are flooded with emotions as she describes the eternal city. "At last I am in Rome. Ah, the recollection of that moment will forever be joy for me. I am in Rome, and so deep is my gratitude, I would gladly kneel and kiss this sacred earth." Madame Levert was not of the Catholic faith, but she was a religious woman with a nominal involvement in the church, in the church of her Episcopalian parents. Despite this, her visit with Pope Pius became the highlight of her stay in Rome. In a letter dated April 19, 1855, she detailed the meeting. "Yesterday, a charming note came informing me that His Holiness would gladly receive us at 4 o'clock in the afternoon. Hence, at that hour, we drove to the Vatican, attired in black, Passing the Swiss guards, we were ushered through long corridors glowing with radiant pictures of Raphael, Murillo, Titian, and Guido. As we stood admiring the pieces, a Monsignor ushered us into a long reception room with an exquisite frescoed ceiling. Near the end of the room, His Holiness was seated. He arose and we entered, and the Monsignor presented us and then retired. As we approached, I knelt and kissed the Pope's hand. At once, we glided into conversation, and I was completely charmed by his honest and truthful manner. The Pope is handsome, about 60 years old, although he appears much younger. As we spoke of our country and its onward progress, we conversed in French, Spanish, English, and Italian. Then he asked Diddy her name, and she replied, Octavia, whereupon His Holiness uttered a most charming blessing. I wish I could repeat all of the words that he said. After an hour's interview, we bade him farewell. We knelt before him, and he placed his hand upon our heads. Octavia's writings are also filled with the pleasure of each new village and city. In Florence, she relished the beauty of great artists. In the Uffizi Palace, she found the beautiful Venus de Medici, sculptured by Phidias more than 3,000 years ago. Octavia observed, "It reminded me of a graceful little figure of a young Creole girl." From the Uffizi, Madame Levert wrote that as she walked to the nearby studio of Hiram Powers, the great American sculptor, to whom she had been given letters of introduction, her journal described the Vermont native as plain and unpretending, a perfect Western man, franked with a cordial manner. Writing to her mother, she scrawled, "Mr. Powers has wonderful eyes, luminous as stars from which glance forth brilliant rays of light." In Powers' studio, Octavia reveled in pleasure as she viewed models of the Greek slave, as well as Eve and his statue of America, which he hoped would be accepted for the Capitol in Washington. Octavia observed, "Beneath America's feet are the chains of tyranny, while one arm is raised with the hand pointing westward." For Octavia, America epitomized and championed the same utopian ideals of democracy and liberty that her grandfather Walton defended. Madame enjoyed meeting Powers. She was introduced to his wife and children, and it is thought that this endearing gesture prompted him to commission a sculpture of Diddy's left hand and forearm. It is interesting to observe Diddy's carte de visite and see the likeness to her mother and compare the marble sculpture to the young subject's arm. Of particular interest was Madame's practice of displaying the piece with the silver gilded bracelet seen in the photograph. The bracelet and a matching brooch remain with the sculpture to the present day. For centuries, the city of Florence and Venice beamed like beacons in the realms of art and science. Talented scholars found the cultured Florentines to be eager patrons. In Florence, Octavia Levert visited both the Museum of Natural History and the home of Galileo, the great astronomer. In a letter to her mother, she describes her fascination with Galileo's starry world. "Mama, you must recollect how passionate I was in my youth. You remember my love for the study of astronomy and how often during those long night hours I would watch the moon and heavenly bodies. Think what a joy it is to me that I have looked at the stars standing on the very same stone that pressed against the feet of Galileo." When examining Octavia Levert's distinct interests in art and science, one finds it understandable that she would be appointed America's only female commissioner to the Paris Exposition of 1855. Whether the appointment was official or honorary, Madame took it seriously. leasing a fine apartment on the Boulevard des Italiens, complete with balconies facing delightful panoramas. The neighboring exhibition hall, seen on the right, was a vast industrial space constructed of glass and metal. She would write, "In certain areas, there are displays of various sorts, including specimens of gorgeous carpets, fabrics, tapestries, pictures, and stained glass. Every industrial form and every artistic achievement can be seen and lauded in this great menagerie." Yet by far, the most thrilling aspect of this monumental exposition was the anticipated visit of Queen Victoria and Prince Albert. It had been more than 450 years since a British sovereign had visited France. Madame described the scene. Paris was filled with excitement. Thousands were on hand from around the world as well as from all of France. When the great day arrived and Queen Victoria entered the city, celebrations began with pageants, concerts, banquets, and balls. One of the most glorious events was the Queen's visit to the Grand Opera. Madame Levert recorded the occasion. "We entered the opera house and seated ourselves in an excellent box, whence we had an admirable view of the royal party the entire evening. About 8 o'clock, we heard shouts from the multitudes in the streets. Then the orchestra played God Save the Queen, and the Emperor Napoleon III entered the state box, leading the sovereign of Great Britain. A burst of joyous acclamation resounded through the edifice. Queen Victoria bowed and curtsied. Then the Princess Eugenie and Prince Albert came in, and they were saluted in the same manner. Both the Queen and the Empress were adorned with blazing tiaras and necklaces and bracelets of great splendor. We were absorbed in viewing magnificent scenes of the impressive tableau. At the conclusion, the finest tenors of France stepped forward in front of the entire opera company to sing a stirring renditions of the English and French national anthems. With the final note, cheers burst forth, and 1,000 handkerchiefs waved in the air. For Octavia, however, the event that was the most memorable was the grand ball honoring Queen Victoria. Again, we view the scene with Madame's description. The many halls of the Hotel de Ville were decorated with huge bouquets and brilliant streams of gaslight. It was like a fairy tale. The most wonderful was a replication of Louis XIV's Hall of Mirrors. In each arcade was a magnificent chandelier and columns encircling flowers. Johann Strauss's orchestra discoursed the most eloquent music, but the room was too dense to think of dancing. Queen Victoria was bright with animation and pleasure. Oh, this glorious evening! It will exist in my memory forever. Returning to Mobile, Madame Levert was besieged with requests to tell of her experiences. Her mother had released some of her exciting letters to the newspaper, and all who read them urged Octavia to begin her book. Using her letters, supplemented with journals, she began writing. The 2 volumes were dedicated to her mother, the loving parent who enabled her to be the social queen in the United States and in Europe. Souvenirs of Travel, published in 1857, reinforced Madame's social prominence and made her an accomplished writer. Her book was hers, but in her eyes it belonged to America. She firmly believed that her writing could help satisfy an American desire to experience history and the world abroad. To emphasize this commitment, Madame pledged some of her proceeds from souvenirs to the Mount Vernon Ladies Association. As vice regent from Alabama, she was dedicated to preserving Washington's house and the president's place in American history. In a letter to the association, she wrote, The first dollars I received from souvenirs of travel, I give to our Mount Vernon. I pray that you will accept this with my offering. I am so proud to share the success that has crowned my efforts as a writer. Madame LeVert's prominence in Mobile diminished with the firing on Fort Sumter. She struggled with the Southern cause and its threats to her grandfather's patriotism. As the Civil War raged, she helped nurse the wounded, remaining sympathetic to those around her. Yet with the death of her husband in 1864 and the surrender of the Confederacy, Octavia's reign in Alabama crumbled. Following the end of the war, she made the grave mistake of welcoming Union officers into her home. Mobile was outraged. She was insulted on Government Street, and her house and carriage were stoned. Rejected and brokenhearted, Alabama's social queen closed her Mobile house and returned to her grandfather's home in Augusta, Georgia. Although she would try, Octavia Walton LeVert never regained her elevated place in American society. Over the next decade, the personality who had reigned both at home and abroad simply faded away. As Madame herself would have said, she vanished like the breath of wind from an ocean's wave. Thank you. We see such contrast in antebellum society, but every person, whether they be a cabinet maker working in the fields, in the Choccolocco Valley, or whether they be the granddaughter of a signer of the Declaration of Independence, or a bridge builder that rose to great heights with architectural contributions, whether they be hands that made baskets for generations, are important. And this is our role, is to not only interpret one segment of society, but to see how all segments can interrelate. And that is what should be our goal today as historians and as individuals who want to foster a greater interest in the decorative arts and history of the state. To make sure that every person, regardless of their walk of life, can have a respect for another segment of society and realize that it took all people to create the village of Alabama.